Hi. It's great to see some familiar pre-COVID faces. It's really fun to be here. So my name is Mary Murphy. I retired from the history department at MSU in August after 32 years of teaching there. And when I want to first thank Liz Johnson for inviting me and Ollie and the Belgrade Library for housing our presentation, and of course, the Belgrade Public Library for our spread of bread. When Liz asked me to do a program about food in concert with the Belgrade community's reading of The Last Green Valley, I said, I haven't read the book. I'm not a European historian. I don't know anything about the Ukraine except what's in the news today. And she said, that's okay. And she said she knew that I taught the history of food. So she said that, well, how many of you have read the novel? Okay, so a few of you. Yeah, okay. So anyway, as Liz said, there's a lot about food during wartime in that book. And so I said, well, I can talk about that if I don't have to, know the specifics of the Ukraine, et cetera. So I thought about some of the material that I've reading and talking about bread and war in my history of food classes. And so that's why I thought that we would talk tonight about war, bread, and memory. So in the program description, I quoted an Indian author, Avijit Das, who wrote, "We need 4 things to survive life: bread, water, oxygen, and dreams." And of course, all 4 of those were very precious commodities, especially during wartime. But first, I want us to consider the term bread itself, right? Because we use bread in so many metaphors, both in its literal meaning and its symbolic meaning. So we have just broken bread together, right? That's a thing that communities do, religious communities or communities of friends, or when you're trying to make friends and ward off enemies and turn people to your side, you generously offer bread. What can you think of some other ways in which we use bread other than slicing your bread? What are some other terms? Communion, right? So communion in Christianity, eating the body and blood of Christ, and it's a bread wafer, an unleavened bread. What anything else? Can you think of? Go ahead. Exactly. And that actually comes from a British expression where dough is money. Give me some dough, give me some bread. So, we have that. And then if you think about breadwinner, that's usually the person who brings money into the household, right? That traditionally the father was the breadwinner, which gave him a lot of authority because he's providing substance for the family. Any other terms you can think of with bread? Don't be shy. How about our daily bread? Give us this day our daily bread. Did he really mean a loaf of bread? I think that we think of that bread becomes a synonym for food, for our the material substance that we need to live, whether it's a loaf of bread or some other kind of food. In politics and economics, people talk about bread and butter issues, right? The essentials. This isn't fancy. This is a bread and butter issue. We're going to get this one through. We hear a lot in the discussions about the place and role of the Ukraine in world economics. That's the breadbasket, right? Just like the middle America, the central part of the United States. On all those maps, at least when I was in grammar school, it was the breadbasket where all the grain would grow. How about the term bread and circuses? Does that? Yeah. What from Roman times, right? That to keep people happy, you need to give them food, bread, and circuses, entertainment, some other kind of reason for feeling a loyalty to your regime. And related to that is an American phrase, bread and roses. Does anybody know that phrase? Bread and roses? That came out of a textile strike in 1912 in Massachusetts, when the women textile workers went on strike, and they used that as their slogan. It was from a poem that had been written the year before. And they said, we want bread and roses too. So you can't just treat us like interchangeable pieces of labor. We need enough to have sustenance for our families, but we also want enough to have some beauty in our lives. So all of these ways that people have used bread, we have all these great names of bread over here, and we have a zillion cookbooks to make wonderful loaves of bread. But it's one of the books I'm going to talk about, and that's on the list I gave you, is a book called 6,000 Years of Bread. So we have had bread for a very long time around the globe, and it's become a metaphor not just for a particular kind of food, but for food itself and for the material substance of life. So I want you to kind of keep in mind that broad meaning of bread while we talk a little bit more about bread and war. And I want to finish so we have time for discussion or comments. If you have questions, just raise your hand throughout. I'm happy to stop. But I would imagine that most of you are familiar with the phrase, an army travels on its stomach, right? Which simply means an army is only as effective as the food that it gets. And that phrase was attributed to both Frederick the Great and Napoleon. So who knows, but it's been around for centuries. We know that despite all historic evidence to the contrary, countries and people have continued to engage in wars thinking that they are going to be short, right? It'll be over by Christmas. We'll be in and out. We can take care of this problem really quickly. As a historian, as people who have lived through many decades of history, you know that that is rarely the case. And it means that inevitably food becomes an issue. So the task of feeding a military and feeding civilians during a war is immensely complicated and intensely political. So even if a country begins a war with what they believe is a sufficient supply of food, great food stores, that country might not have an adequate transportation system to get that food where it needs to be, because wars never go according to plan. Packing, storage, preservation of foodstuffs all become problematic depending upon length of time in transit, the conditions in which that food is going to be stored or distributed. So all countries who have gone to war, again, as I said, I'm not a European historian, but certainly since the Civil War on, have had huge agencies to deal with food, both on the civilian level and in the military level. The other problem with food and war is that prolonged warfare disrupts agricultural production. So if you think about France during World War I, the fertile fields of France that were so productive became nightmarish trenches, and thousands of farmers were slaughtered. So the French agricultural system was destroyed. Even after war ends, reconstructing an agricultural system and a system of trade for foodstuffs takes time. So England, in the Second World War, began food rationing in January 1940. Does anybody know when it ended, food rationing in England? Wild guesses? 1954, so 9 years after the end of the war. The politics of wartime food breaks down what's really always an imaginary line between civilians and the military, especially in countries on which war takes place. So national leaders first presume and then end up having to mandate that civilians will make sacrifices to feed their armies. But they also know it's a fine line before disruption of people's habitual diets becomes problematic. So rationing, which is designed to preserve greater food sources for the military and yet feed civilians in an acceptable level, that worked well in some places, and it was not effectively organized in others. And everywhere it creates black markets and food hoarders. So that the idea behind rationing to distribute food fairly only works if everybody agrees to it. And we haven't seen a war where everybody agrees to it, okay? And of course, starvation wins no loyalty to any country. So one could argue for that any state, to hold the loyalty of its citizens, it needs to provide food security. And going back to the Romans, to bread and circuses, this was the idea that this is why countries have food. They don't have just weapon stockpiles, they have food stockpiles, right? So if there's a famine, if there's a bad harvest, if there's some kind of emergency, that the state can step in and make sure that people have some food. It might not always be the food that they would choose, but they're not starving or hungry. Many societies from the Middle Ages on through the 19th century regulated the price of bread in an effort to make sure that everyone had something to eat. It was very complicated. It was called the Aziz of bread, and each community would often get together and they might decide to regulate the price of wheat. They might decide to regulate the size of a loaf of bread. They might decide to regulate the amount of profit a baker could have. And they would sometimes meet several times over the year to assess the harvest, how much was in storage, what kind of grain was coming in and out. But the idea was that everybody should have a basic level of bread. And basic was often sometimes quite stingy. But, the idea was that you would feed the people and they would not rebel against you. And we, of course, have many examples in history of that exact thing happening. But the Aziz of bread was a social contract, right? So say we're a community and we have some bakers and we have grain growers and we have millers. We all have our own interests. And then we have the majority of us who just eat bread and do some other kind of work. So we have to come together. We make a social contract among ourselves, not any particular law, but that says, we are going to check in with each other several times over the course of the year and make sure that wheat growers and millers and bakers are all getting fair compensation for their work and that everybody's getting enough bread, their daily bread. So one bread historian, the man who wrote 6,000 Years of Bread, said, since the beginnings of the world, have not the justest minds determined that bread, like air and water, must not serve to profit individuals? Not an idea we necessarily hold to. But in his book, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of his stories, he related a legend from the medieval times called The Legend of the Miser of Mainz. And it was a story that this miser was taken off by the devil because he had kept a sack of bread until it was stale, having refused to give it away to the poor when it was fresh. So all these kinds of, and this book is many, many hundreds of pages and full of stories and legends about bread. So there are many examples in history of people rioting and rising in revolution because they have no bread. And perhaps the most famous is in modern history is in France. In 1788, there was a terrible harvest marked by drought and hunger, and it compounded people's grievances against the monarchy, against the king and queen. So in streets and squares, angry people demanded pain d'égalité, bread of equality. And the hungry rebels stormed the Bastille, they guillotined the king and queen, and they set off the French Revolution because they had no bread. It was more complicated, but. So I'm going to talk about food, hunger, and war in World War II, but I want to read you a poem that was written by a British poet in December 1918. So just the month before had been the armistice of World War I, which at the time, of course, was known as the Great War, because no one could imagine there would be a World War II. So his name was Lawrence Binyon, and this is his poem. I come among the people like a shadow. I sit down by each man's side. None sees me, but they look on one another and know that I am here. My silence is like the silence of the tide that buries the playground of children, like the deepening of frost in the slow night when birds are dead in the morning. Armies trample, invade, destroy, with guns roaring from earth and air. I am more terrible than armies. I am more feared than cannons. Kings and chancellors give commands. I give no command. But I am listened to more than kings and more than passionate orators. I unswear words and undo deeds. Naked things know me. I am first and last to be felt of the living. I am hunger. So hunger is a strong theme in the novel some of you are reading. It's going to be a depressing theme in what I'm going to tell you for the rest of this talk. But I promise a little uplifting story at the end. Okay. He was an English poet named Lawrence, Laurence, Binyon. So you can find it on the web. Oh, so the Belgrade Library. Liz, do you want to talk about it? I didn't have anything to do with it. Yeah.
So we do a one-book read where the whole community to read a book. Our book is The Last Green Valley by Mark Walden. So he's a local author writing about what he was inspired by the origins of how the Martel family came. So it takes place in World War II, and they have to make their way west towards Germany. They're from Ukraine, being pushed out by the Russians. Very compelling story, so I wouldn't read it, obviously. But that's what Ocean references.
Yeah. And yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's written as a novel, but it's based on his research into this one family, which ended up in Bozeman. Gallatin Valley was the last green valley for that family, right? That wasn't really a spoiler. No. Okay. Okay. So I imagine that many of you have actually read a lot more about the history of World War II than I have. I'm not a military historian. It's not really my period. But I am interested in food policies and food history. And as I prepared for this talk, I came across some very, very compelling books and articles about the way in which memory of food worked to help people survive in prison camps, labor camps, concentration camps. So the first thing to know is, in the sort of context, is that the statistics for death during World War II are very unreliable. One, it's just really hard to keep good statistics during a war. And especially with countries who want to sometimes exaggerate and sometimes minimize their number of casualties because of politics, right? We know this from COVID. So you may commonly see a figure of 19.5 million military deaths, and that included many soldiers who died of starvation or more so of malnutrition, I should say. And malnutrition, do you want to speak as a doctor, versus starvation? Okay, so malnutrition is eating the wrong things, right? Not getting the right vitamins that you need, and that can have a lot of consequences on your development. That's why we're so concerned about children having all the right vitamins and minerals, et cetera, et cetera. Starvation is literally not having enough food. Yeah. So more soldiers died of malnutrition, associated diseases, and some of starvation while fighting. A commonly cited figure for civilian deaths is 20 to 25 million people. The millions of civilians who died in Africa and Asia are not accurately counted at all. But there's estimates that that might have been up to 20 million. So for us, it just means far more civilian deaths than military deaths, right? And so I'll give you one specific example to show how difficult it is to assess the accuracy of these figures. When Singapore fell to the Japanese in 1942, thousands of Chinese in Singapore and the Malay Peninsula were killed. Japanese sources acknowledge the death of 5,000 Chinese men. Chinese sources say that 30,000 men, women, and children were killed in Singapore alone, and another 20,000 on the peninsula. So there's a big difference between 5,000 and 50,000. So it's just sort of, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, how do we even comprehend a number like 40 million people, right, dying in World War II? So it's good to just take it all with a grain of salt. You know, we're just gonna think of it as massive right here, right, and not worry about those details. So food policy was one of the driving forces for some of the worst Nazi atrocities during the war. Their experience in World War I had shown the National Socialist leadership that an adequate food supply was critical to the maintenance of both military and civilian morale. So food policy was really in the forefront of planning for the Nazi regime. And the deliberate extermination by starvation of targeted groups was a defining feature of the Nazi food system. So German agronomists intended to create an agricultural empire on lands that they were confident Germany would conquer to the east, right? So that they would conquer in Russia or the Ukraine. The siege of Leningrad, in which 1 million people died of starvation, the blockades of Kiev and Kharkov, another 200,000 dead of starvation, were the first steps in that World War II policy. And the Nazis used the science of nutrition which had really burgeoned in the first half of the 20th century, to calculate caloric targets for different people. So just one example. The daily ration for Polish Jews was 184 calories. So we ate more than that in our bread before we started talking. The majority of the 100,000 Jews who died in the Warsaw Ghetto died of starvation. As one historian wrote, the policy was designed to create a well-fed master race, a race of workers too weak to rise, and a race of corpses. The Japanese made no overt plans to systematically eliminate the Chinese, but in the 1930s, thousands of farmers were evicted from their homes and left to starve to make way for Japanese settlers in Manchuria. Another way in which famine took place was conquering armies plundering foodstuffs from occupied countries, which left famine in its wake. So when Germany invaded Greece in 1941, troops either consumed or packed and shipped to Germany everything that was edible. An American woman who witnessed the invasion noted that bread was the thing that the Athenians were most disturbed about. After the occupation, it was not black, it was gray. All the cereals of the country were put together with sawdust. And 500,000 people died in Greece. Perhaps a more startling and lesser known story is what happened in British India. So it was not, I want to be clear here that it was not just the Axis powers who contributed to the millions of people who died of starvation during World War II. A confluence of events led to famine in the province of Bengal in 1943-44. But one key factor was Winston Churchill's refusal to send any food aid to this British colony, right? 43-44, India is not independent. In fact, Churchill despised Indians and their independence movement. He is said to have thought that Indians were, quote, the beastliest population in the world next to Germans. And he was not alone. A British committee to look into the question of food supplies for India decided that the risk of civilian hunger in India was a lesser evil than jeopardizing British civilian food supplies or military supplies for the Indian Army. And the Indian Army was an army made up of men from India under the command of British troops. It was crucial to the British campaign in Burma. So that's why the Indian Army rations were protected. So at least 1.2 million people starved just in the province of Bengal. Perhaps another million succumbed to disease. And during this period of time, England sent out a new viceroy, a man named Wavell, and he was really devastated by what he saw. And he repeatedly wrote to, telegrammed, whatever transportation or communication they had then, to London asking for food for India. And Churchill said, if food was so scarce in India, why had Gandhi not yet died? He really loathed Gandhi. So Wavell fought hard for food relief for India, and when he heard of the wealth of supplies that were airlifted to Holland in March of 1945, he remarked bitterly, a very different attitude exists toward feeding a starving population when the population is in Europe. So I have to say, I did not know that story until I started reading for this, but our friend Michelle knows all about it. Indian historians do. So perhaps there's no other 20th century event that has generated more memoirs, novels, histories, biographies, films as World War II. You know, I'm always struck when I go into a large chain bookstore, the history section is always organized by war. You know, that's how you find your books. If you're an author, you want to fit it into a wartime period. There's stories of battles and stories and memoirs of captivity. And in fact, two of the books, I've given you that yellow sheet that has some of the books I used in my reading for this. And it also has a recipe from one of the cookbooks the cookbook I'm going to talk about. So two of the books were written because the men who wrote them, their families were involved in World War II, And it provoked their fathers, and it provoked themselves to think about bread. So the author of Our Daily Bread, a Croatian writer, was a hungry child during the war who did not recognize his father when he was released from a labor camp because he had lost 90 pounds while he was there. And he has many grim stories. His book is called Our Daily Bread, a meditation on bread, and it's, again, starts back with the Romans and sort of meanders up to the war. But his father also told him this story. He said on Christmas Eve, 1943, his father was with a group of prisoners cutting and trimming trees for Germany's rail ties. That night, returning from the forest, a stranger met them and invited them and their guard into his house. He gave them a chance to warm up, to wash, to shave, and when they had, he brought them to his table, where he had placed a slice of bread and a glass of wine at each place. And then he served them a simple meal. The German guard never reported this, and Predrag's father told his son, that after that day, he never again equated his captors with the nation they came from. He said, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. Okay. So another author, the author of the 6,000 Years of Bread, H.E. Jacob was a well-off Jew, German Jew, living in Vienna, who was arrested in 1938. And he spent a year in Dachau and Buchenwald before his American relatives were able to get his release. He had friends in high places. So he had started his research for this book on bread before he was put into these camps. And then when he got to the United States, he continued his research. The book was written in German. It came out in English in 1944. So the end of his book is before the war is over. And then it wasn't published in German until 1954. So at the very end of his book, he says, in the Buchenwald concentration camp, we had no real bread at all. What was called bread was a mixture of potato flour, peas, and sawdust. The inside was the color of lead. The crust looks and tasted like iron. The thing sweated water like the brow of a tormented man. Nevertheless, we called it bread in memoriam of the real bread we had formerly eaten. So bread becomes this powerful memory. So many stories about bread, food, and memory come from prisoners or from survivors of prison camps who had very little control over what kind of food they ate, and as the war progressed, no control over the amount of food that they got. I've chosen some examples both from Europe and from Singapore to show how widely memories of food were shared among prisoners and how they used memories of food as tools of survival. So some of you probably know the psychiatrist, writer, Viktor Frankl. Yep, Frankl. His best-known book was Man's Search for Meaning. And he spent 3 years in 4 different concentration camps. Writing after the war, he said, in the camps, the desire for food was the major primitive instinct around which mental life was centered. And we have lots of evidence of that from various survivors' memoirs. So that desire for food came in many forms, and one of the most interesting is what one historian called culinary imagination. So and I've since found several works about this. So what these authors did when they looked at oral histories and at memoirs, stories about incarceration, they said that prisoners, rather than attempting to suppress hunger, fantasized about elaborate meals. And they composed recipes, and in a few cases, they actually compiled cookbooks. They acknowledged their obsession with food, and they made play out of it. And what I mean by play is the work of imagining yourself in another place. So for them, it was often around a table, eating wonderful food. A Canadian scholar wrote, their fantasies took the prisoners away from their hunger. Right? So you would think, wouldn't thinking about this food make you more hungry, but it was satisfying to think about what they could eat when they got out of the camp, or what they had eaten, how they would make it. So here's one memory from Europe. Ruth Kluger recalled the adult women in camp exchanged recipes, she said, the same way that I recited poems. A nighttime favorite game was to surpass each other with the recital of generous amounts of butter, eggs, and sugar in fantasy baking contests. If they only knew the British baking show was in their future. So she says, I didn't even know the dishes that they cooked, and I listened with a growling stomach, just as I listened with a hungry imagination to their tales of travel, parties, dates, and university studies, their estates of memory, okay, their castles of memory. Another survivor recalled another pastime, which actually was more than a pastime, she said. It was an obsession of practically everybody, was exchanging recipes for food. We had terrible quarrels, because if you said this recipe needed 3 eggs, somebody else said, no, you needed 5 eggs. We argued whether you needed hot water, hot milk, or cold milk. It was an obsession. We couldn't think of much else other than food. We exchanged these recipes at night. We woke up somebody saying, do you remember your mother's recipe for that? This is important, tell me. That happened in all the camps, she said. And some women tried to create a semblance of food that they had known before they were imprisoned. A young woman said, we acted as if the skim milk we were rationed was whipping cream, and we beat it into a foam, a popular pastime. It could take hours, because it's difficult to make skim milk foam with a fork. So you can imagine, okay? Susan Cernak-Spatz, a survivor of Terezin and Auschwitz, said, women spoke about food so much that some camps had a phrase to define it. We called it cooking with the mouth, cooking with the mouth. And it was not only women who fantasized about food. In a posthumously published short story by Kurt Vonnegut called Guns Before Butter, he has 3 American soldiers in Dresden fantasizing about what they will eat when they get home and talking recipes. And more than talking, they became obsessed with writing it all down. So one of the soldiers had taken several notebooks from a bombed-out stationery store, and all 3 soon became bedeviled with filling these notebooks with recipes. But the first thing they would put is the meal that they were going to eat when they got home. Vonnegut himself had been a prisoner in Dresden, so some of you who read Slaughterhouse-Five would know that. And he said, setting down the symbols for food somehow made them feel much closer to the real thing. So rather than thinking about this food as, something far off, it really brought it closer to home. When one of his soldiers finds crayons, he begins drawing pictures of mouth-watering cakes. And one of the other soldiers says, can you draw a Lady Baltimore cake? Can you draw this cake? Et cetera, et cetera. So Vonnegut makes his story funny, but he's basing it on real desires and real experiences. An Israeli, Sabina Margulis, said, if we had paper at Auschwitz, we could have written recipes down there. And if we had been able to write them down, we would have had a cookbook of thousands of pages. So I want to shift to Singapore. In the Changi prison in Singapore, one woman accomplished that feat of putting a cookbook together. Changi had been built as a state-of-the-art prison by the British opened in 1937. But when Singapore fell to the Japanese in 1942, the Japanese incarcerated about 3,500 civilian prisoners there. And the prison had been built to house a max of 600. So the civilians were British, American, Dutch, and Eurasian. There were other military POW camps in the Changi area. So if you get interested in this, I had to kind of figure out what was the prison, which was the civilian place, and what were the military camps. So in the European camps, both men and women fantasized about food as their rations decreased. Prisoners suffered, the Japanese were not deliberately trying to starve people to death in these camps, but they had very poor food and very little of it. So they suffered semi-starvation and related diseases such as beriberi, a deficit in thiamine, tropical ulcers, dysentery, and edema. So on the men's side, so the men and women were housed in two wings of the prison. And on the men's side, a planter, Malaya was of course so valuable to both the Allies and the Japanese because of its rubber plantations. So a planter named Campbell Newington created a gourmet club. And what he would do, he and some of his fellow prisoners gathered around a box on which they balanced a sheet of asbestos. Who would care about asbestos when you were starving in World War II? And they created formal dinners with complete menus served on tables set with words. So just like talking food with, cooking with your mouth. And Newington wrote down as many recipes as he could. But one of the most interesting characters that I came across in this is a woman named Ethel Mulvaney. And she was a Canadian married to a British Army doctor, and they were in Singapore at the time of the Battle of Singapore, the fall of Singapore. Now, she had worked with the Australian Red Cross before the Battle of the Malay Peninsula in Singapore because the British governor refused to set up a British branch of the Red Cross because he didn't think it would ever be necessary. So she continued with Red Cross work as best she could in the prison. So the Japanese, like many other countries, nations in the war, prioritized food for their troops. And at the end of the war, when the Japanese had surrendered and allies come to free the prisoners, they find in Singapore warehouses full of rice that just had not been distributed. And as many of you know, Japan did not ratify the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and they did not bind themselves to its conventions. So one of the things the Red Cross did during the war was send packages of food and medicine to camps, labor camps, prison camps, concentration camps. And they sent packages to Singapore, but only 2 rounds were delivered to Changi. One shipment of food and medicine in 1943, another in April 1945. Again, at the end of the war, warehouses were found full of Red Cross packages that had not been delivered. And the one that was delivered in 1945, the tinned food was okay. Everything else was moldy and riddled with weevils. And the packages were dated March 1942. So they had sat in those warehouses for 3 years. Ethel Mulvaney was an organizer by her nature. And so she organized many women into these fantasy tea parties. And she recalled an Australian housewife who started a session by setting the table in words with all the details from where she would put the salt to what kind of flour she would have in her centerpiece. And only then could they talk about food. And the first food they talked about was bread and butter. So Ethel sees the next step as trying to write down these recipes. And she found old copies of the Straits Times, a Singaporean newspaper, in the dungeon of the jail. And after the women talked through the recipes, they wrote them down on, they tore off strips of the edge of the newspaper, the margins of the newspaper, and they would write down these recipes. So the Japanese would not permit anyone to write letters or keep diaries in the camps, but they did give the women 2 old jail ledgers. And so Ethel took charge of this project, and women wrote in the, the blue ledger, but only Ethel wrote in the red ledger. And she would write down her own stories and recipes, but then also other ones that people had told her, and menu plans. So at the end of the war, Ethel was able to save these ledgers. They contained 770 recipes and more than 50 menu plans for 7-course meals. And there were over 60 women who had contributed to the collection. So, as in many cases, when the Japanese took Singapore and rounded up civilians, they had a short amount of time to carry with them what they could. It was like a 9 or 10 mile march to the prison. And Ethel had taken her Canadian cookbook. And she was not alone in this. She wrote in the back of the red ledger the names of 10 other cookbooks that people had bought. And you can come up and look at this afterwards. This is an earlier version. The 5 Roses cookbook is a Canadian institution. So the 5 Roses was a flour company. And they had published the cookbook starting in the 1890s. This is a 1915 edition. She had the 1932 edition. And in addition to talking about recipes, women would get in groups. They would read these recipes over and over again. They would talk about what changes they had made, who in their family liked this, et cetera, et cetera. So I looked up just before I came. The 1932 5 Roses cookbook is very rare now. It's hundreds of dollars. So interesting, the 1915 one is more common. So in the red ledger, Ethel begins her recipes, begins with the recipes for the prisoner's favorite food, which was bread. That's what they missed the most. And she starts her story. She writes it in the form of a story. And she starts with the moment she sends her Malay servant to the markets to get yeast. And then she describes her process of crumbling the yeast into her mixture of flour, salt, sugar, and water, the mixing and the kneading of the dough. She continues the story of her bread making over 2 days as the dough rises, is kneaded again, is divided, and then rises again. Ethel also got permission because she really harangued the Japanese commander of the camp, and she was later severely punished. But she got permission for the women to stitch 3 Red Cross quilts, and each woman would take a square and they would stitch some kind of design, often a message that they hoped their husbands might see. So Violet Aitken stitched the words Changi Lifesaver, and she surrounded a lifesaver, the old kind of lifesavers on board a ship, with a life belt also encircling a loaf of bread. Eunice Austin Hoffer from Australia stitched a bottle of wine and a brown crusted loaf of bread resting beside a tree branch. So this was in their imaginations. So Changi prison was liberated in early September 1945. The shock that Allied troops had experienced when they liberated the Nazi concentration camps was echoed by troops in the Pacific. Ethel overheard one of the soldiers say, "This is like coming into a valley of bones with a bit of flesh hanging here and there." So when prisoners were brought to hospital ships, all they wanted was bread. It was as someone said, far more precious to them than gold. And of course, the medical personnel in Europe had learned that they couldn't give the prisoners all the food they wanted right away. It just made them terribly sick. So they had a different regime in Asia. So Ethel returns to Canada to live with an aunt and uncle in Ontario, and she was asked to write about her experiences. But she could not order her mind to write that saga. She had been interrogated and tortured by the Japanese. There had been I think it was called the Double Tenth event, and a small group of Australian military had actually sailed a small boat to Singapore and had blown up some of the Japanese oil tanks. And the Japanese were convinced that it had to be people in the Changi prison who had conspired with them. And so they greatly restrict rations for everyone, and they torture people who they knew had contacts outside the camp. And Ethel had a lot of Chinese friends and friends who were still free, who had been helping to get them money where they could buy food earlier in their experience. So she's in terrible condition, both mentally and physically. But she realizes that she has her ledgers, these recipe books. And so she puts together a cookbook. And this is a PDF, if you want to look at this cookbook. I'll tell you how many were printed, et cetera, but this, it was no fancy publication. She got a printer around the corner from her aunt's house. She goes in and she says, here's $1. I want you to print 2,000 copies of this. And he says, are you crazy? And she says, no, I'll get you the money, et cetera, et cetera. So she wears them down. And, but it's just typed on flimsy paper and, reproduced. And she decides that she will sell this cookbook by going to give talks to local groups like the Kiwanis and the Rotary. So she goes to the group with a suitcase full of cookbooks. She puts it at the back of the room, and she gives her talk, and she says, pay what you want. And she had to go back to the printer again and again. And eventually he produced 20,000 copies, and she made $18,000. Now, she didn't make that money for herself. She didn't put the cookbook together with any desire for recognition. In fact, she only put her initials on the cookbook, ERM. So for a long time, nobody knew who this was, who had done this. She used the money to send oranges, tea, and cigarettes to ex-POWs who were still hospitalized in England. She was really pleased to be able to send them this citrus fruit, right? And all of it came from Canada. Eaton's, which was the major department store in Canada, shipped all the goods. And she had 2 friends from the army from Singapore and India who delivered them for her. So I'm going to read you part of the introduction that she wrote to this book. It was just 1 page, and I'm not going to read the whole page. She wrote, "We had been prisoners of the Japanese for many months. Days were long, we were very hungry. I decided to compile a recipe book, and soon we were all writing recipes. It seemed to help when we were most hungry. I made this collection when I weighed 85 pounds. We left many of our friends in Malaya. They died in battle, they died on the firing line, they died in the prison camps from starvation. They died before the firing squad. They died in the camp hospitals from every disease known to man. They died as they worked barebacked and barefooted in the work gangs on the Siam Railway. They were all hungry. Many of those who were prisoners and have returned to England have not been able to have many of the extras that we have in Canada. So as from one Canadian who survived the horrors of war and prison camp, May I just say, enjoy your food, enjoy your homes. There's nothing that can take their place. You can imagine her giving this talk in the late 40s. In a study of the process of this culinary imagination, the work of this culinary imagination in European camps, one historian came across women who talked about how important it was to record the names of the women who had come up with these recipes. She said, attributing a recipe to a grandmother or aunt or mother who was absent from the conversation because she had been starved, beaten, or gassed to death, figuratively restored her to the circle of women and embedded her in listeners' memories. But Ethel felt differently. When she brought her typed manuscript to the printer noticed that on several of the recipes she had not included the name of the person who had created it or contributed it. And when he asked her if she wanted to add them, she said that so many had died, to name them was to disturb the peace of the dead. She said, I feel better not to call them. So I want to leave you with a little more upbeat story. And this is based on an oral interview with a woman named Bella in Europe. In late 1945, Bella and her husband, Ike, escaped their labor camp, rowed across the Elbe River, and surrendered to the Americans in Magdeburg, Germany. So the GIs liberated a deserted house where they installed Bella, Ike, and two friends, Oscar and Bessie, who had escaped with them. The GIs also brought them an abundance of food, which Ike, Bessie, and Oscar eyed hungrily. After 6 years of imprisonment and hunger, they were ready to eat. But Bella stopped them. She said, wait. And her husband and their friends and the GIs were all perplexed. She said, I want a white tablecloth, and I want to set the table. So the GIs jumped in their Jeep, as American can-do will, and they returned within a few minutes, laden with table linens that they had liberated from another house. Bella's explanation was firm and simple. We will not eat like savages, she said. After 6 years of holding onto my dignity in spite of everything the Nazis did, I won't give them a victory. Bella took the white cloth, set the table, invited her husband and friends to dine with her, and in her words, ate like a free woman. So thank you. Right on the dot. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy for you to take a look at the cookbooks up here, share any stories you might have, get up and move around. Yes, Jake. I have read it. Yeah, I did. I did read it, yes. Yeah, the one that the Belgrade Library is reading. Yeah. Yeah, Diane. Oh, yeah. And her cookbook was published. There were several others in different camps that also made cookbooks, and they're in different archives. The printed copy of hers is in the one of them is in the Canada War Museum, and you can look at it online. There's another one from an English woman who was in a Japanese camp in China, and it's in the Imperial War Museum. But they all agree. There's lots of errors. There's missing things. There's no measurements. And some of the recipes are just addled because their minds were addled when they were writing them down, you know. And so on the sheet, I put this, included this recipe for pumpkin scones, there's a book, A Taste of Longing is about Ethel Mulvaney. And she starts each chapter with a recipe. But the pumpkin scone one is interesting because it just says fat, doesn't say how much. And Ethel, early in their incarceration, she had gotten permission to take money that the prisoners had and that the Red Cross funded and go into the markets one day a week. But the Japanese said, you have to tell us what you're going to get. And of course, guards went with her. She gets a message from a Chinese banker who was a friend of hers. And he said, go to the number 23 pumpkin stall. And so she's terrified because she had not told the Japanese she was going to get pumpkins. But she goes there, and they sell her all these pumpkins, which she takes back to camp, and she takes to this storeroom. And she goes in, and the pumpkin tops had been cut with a wire and stuffed with cash. So the prisoners could then buy more food. And she's like, oh my God, what if the guard comes in? What if somebody realizes this? And nothing happened at that point. But I love the fact they include, because you don't think pumpkin scones, right? But everything has meaning. Yeah, yeah. She got permission to buy food for the women, but that was right in 42, early 43. After that, they clamped down. Yeah, because the Japanese also at the beginning, people brought food with them, and they expected them to supplement. Really, they were eating grass soup. So, yeah. Yes.
In your research, did you ever come across an event that happened in Ukraine between the wars? During the period that started an absolute campaign to starve the Ukrainians by Stalin?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Use that.
Yeah. Jim, do you want to comment on the Ukrainian? So Jim Meyer is your speaker for next week. I highly recommend him. He's a historian from my department and a specialist in Russia and Central Asia.
Well, I'd say there were actually multiple areas in the Soviet Union. Stalin in the 1930s was referring to, where people were starved. And a lot of this had to do with certain cases of, basically, because the Soviet government had attacked a lot of small peasants' farms that had been, stockpiling food because they were resisting militarization, and they were punished for that reason. This actually occurred in a number of places in the Soviet Union, but largely in Ukraine, because Ukraine, of course, was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And in recent decades, something that has begun to be seen as a genocide.
And also an attempt to crush ideas of any Ukrainian nationalism that had, emerged around World War I, do you think?
I think it had more to do with crushing peasants who were referred to as kulaks. These were sort of wealthy. When we hear the word peasant, we don't really think of like wealthy peasants, but these were sort of wealthy peasants who had small farms and, who didn't want to give up all their wheat and their eggs to state collective farms. And they hid it away and stuff like that, and were being punished for this. And because the farmland was so good in Ukraine, there was a large number of people in Ukraine doing this specifically. But one thing that needs to be remembered, this wasn't only in Ukraine. There were large parts of fertile lands in Russia itself, where similarly, because the government was so hell-bent on punishing these small farmers, that they ended up starving millions of people. And it wasn't only Ukrainians who were attacked by this.
Yeah.
I think it was more of an attack on a class of people than a nationality.
And there is a book called Red Famine by Anna Applebaum that is about this as well. I didn't put it on the list. Yeah. I'm sorry, could you say that again? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. There's lots of blame to go around. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Jim. Yeah.
I remember reading a book by a woman named Anna Carpens years ago. I can't remember the name of the book. She was a survivor of the death camps in the early 1940s. And she writes about was in a camp with she was a teenage girl when she was busted through the camps, and she was in basically with a number of other young women of her age, and then they were liberated, and they went and just gorged themselves on food. And in these memoirs, she mentions these memoirs are really about kind of the experience of what people did after they were liberated.
Mm-hmm.
And she mentions a number of people actually dying
Mm-hmm.
because they're just so hungry and they finally had food and they filled themselves up so much that they died.
Their
Was
systems
this
just,
something you ran across?
yeah, their systems couldn't process it. And that's what the medical people learned after the German experience of the camps. And so when it's only a short time later, but they're in Asia, they're trying to like just give them a little soup, give them like a quarter size of mushed carrots. And she talks about on board ship, she gets a little piece of like boiled chicken, a little thing of mashed potatoes, and a little circle of carrots. And she eats it all and she licks the plate. But she said other people threw up the carrots, but they still wanted more. And then one of the things, I mean, gosh, I could go down so many rabbit holes, but the biology of hunger. So when she's back in Canada, she meets a minister, and she said they immediately recognized each other as prisoners of war. They hadn't known each other. And they confessed to each other that they steal food and they hoard it. So she has food hidden all over the house, including smelly cheese, which her aunt ignores. And here he is. He says, I'm a minister and I'm a thief. And like one time she eats 6 pounds of cherries at a sitting because she just, and there's, lots of work on the long-term effects of hunger. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to encourage you to eat more bread. Yeah, yeah.
Nearly 90 years of experience, not one day of real serious hunger. Is that unusual? Is that what we all experience? Have any of us really experienced hunger
Okay.
much in a way?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're probably in the country that is least likely, though we certainly have many people who suffer from hunger. Yeah. And I think that to me that was what was so touching in Ethel Mulvaney's introduction, was her wishing that you would never have that experience of hunger. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Phil's from Leonard, Wyoming, has also a leadership school that these educations, so we're not many of us really have discussions. 5 days at the end of an expedition is called survival. And so they said, okay, you eat all your food, you're going to burn.
Mm.
Okay? So measures to survive and what you learn. So first day costs concentration 1. Second day costs concentration. You're getting closer to ready to go. And everybody out there eats all the food. And the last 2 days, all we do is talk about food.
Uh-huh.
And so
Uh-huh.
when they finally got to the tail, they have to decide and start themselves back on the trail. This is they talked about food. So the exact situation.
Mm.
We sat and stuffed ourselves with food for about
Mm-hmm.
something.
Yeah. 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 I mean, to me, reading about this, it was so depressing and so horrific in what people do to each other. But the stories of like Ethel and the people who were one of the books is called In Memory's Kitchen, and it's about the camps in Europe. they're such stories of resilience, you know. And people, you know, I mean, the enemy in the camps was not always the Nazis or the Japanese. People did not get along. You know, she talks about in the British camp how you know, there's all these British civilians, and there's a class structure that holds over from British society. And so, you know, it wasn't everybody against the enemy. There was lots of rivalry and backbiting, theft, you know, being hungry and the effects that had on your mental capacity. It was hard. Yes.
So you spoke mostly about World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Your research, have you found, have you looked into if there are accounts from last year in Ukraine?
Oh,
Were you able to?
right. I haven't done any research on that. Yeah, yeah. But it was funny on the drive over, there was a story on NPR about the Ukrainian ballet company performing in Washington, D.C. the other night. And they ended it by, the orchestra played the Ukrainian national anthem, and I'm like, you know, yeah. Yeah.
I can't help wonder if that's why when I was growing up, it said, eat everything, everybody eats everything on the whole table, and the sun will shine tomorrow. And it seems like it's
Yeah,
a reaction or
yeah.
something. Tell me something.
Right. You know, the other thing that's important to this story is to remember that a lot of the people who were in World War II had just come out of the Depression. And you know, many recruits, draftees to the U.S. Army were rejected because their health was so bad, they were malnourished from the Depression. And Ethel talks about, you know, she was from an era when education included the memorization of a lot of poetry. And so she remembers one day reciting this poem by a Canadian author called The Depression Ends. And it's about food. It's a horrible poem. I looked it up. It's 6 pages in couplets, rhyming couplets. Oh my God. But, you know, these were people who had known hunger. A lot of these people had known hunger in other ways. And it's again why Germany had known terrible hunger during World War I and the Depression. And so that's why they were so determined to have enough food. And they knew from personal experience that the withdrawal of food could be a potent weapon. Yeah. And people talked at the end of the war, you know, the U.S. Army was the best fed army in the world. And it's World War II where they start using food aid as a policy, right, as a policy. So enriched white bread is developed during World War II. And during the reconstruction of Japan, the U.S. is intent on getting the Japanese to give up rice and eat white bread to become civilized. So, so there's so many tentacles of food policy and food as a weapon, really. Yeah, yeah. Anything else, other comments or questions? Well, I'm really grateful for your attention. Thank you.